"You're not real family." My husband's mother told me across a dining table that had seated 3 generations before me, so I took her son off her will. My name is Ava Max. I'm 35 years old, a child development therapist based in New Haven, Connecticut. I didn't grow up with wealth or old silverware passed down through bloodlines. My parents were teachers, quiet and observant people who believed more in listening than performing. I inherited their patience, their attention to detail, and their deep sense of emotional literacy skills that became useful in ways I never expected when I married into the Cole family. I met Nathan at a behavioral science symposium hosted by Yale. I was presenting a study on cognitive development in early childhood, and he was there as a guest speaker on investment decision-making under stress. His world was spreadsheets and strategy. Mine was bedtime routines and the psychology of tantrums. But we clicked. There was something effortless about our first conversation, and a shared softness that surprised us both. We started dating, quietly, without much fanfare. No Instagram announcements, no dramatic milestones, just long walks after work, shared podcasts, and the ease of 2 people who didn't have to prove anything to each other. He didn't talk much about his family at first, and I didn't push. He only said they were old-fashioned, which I took to mean conservative or formal. I found out later it meant something closer to dynastic. Nathan was the youngest son in the Cole family, a clan of generational financiers who lived in a sprawling Georgian-style estate overlooking the water. His mother, Gloria Cole, ran the family trust like a CEO runs a Fortune 500 company. The Cole name opened doors in every New England boardroom and closed them just as fast when they disapproved. When Nathan proposed after 14 months, I was deeply in love and maybe a little naive. I thought if I showed up with good intentions, honesty, and kindness, his family would meet me halfway. The first time I met Gloria was at her birthday brunch. She wore a cream wool coat over a navy dress and pearls that felt as heavy as her silence. Her tone was polite, her smile controlled, but her eyes never left mine, not in warmth, not in curiosity, but in assessment, as if she were scanning a spreadsheet titled, "Why She's Not One of Us." Still, I tried. I brought her hand-milled soaps from a local artisan I admired, which she barely glanced at before setting them aside. I asked about her work with the Children's Foundation she chaired, and she responded with a single sentence that ended the conversation. It's mostly legacy administration now. That word legacy kept returning. In the wedding planning meetings, she insisted on joining. In the seating chart, she rearranged. In the menu, she changed to reflect family tradition. Even though Nathan and I were both vegetarian, by the time we reached the altar, I'd quietly surrendered so many decisions that the ceremony no longer felt like ours. But the real shift happened after our daughter Isla was born. Gloria began showing up more frequently, sometimes unannounced, holding monogrammed baby blankets none of us had asked for. She made comments that stung in their subtlety. Isla cries a lot. Coles are usually calm babies. Or, your schedule is very modern. When Nathan was little, we didn't rely on apps and gadgets to parent. I told myself to let it go, pick my battles, keep the peace. But over time, those small slights built into something more insidious, a steady chipping away of my role as a mother, as a wife, as someone worthy of belonging. Still, I never expected her to say it out loud. That night, at her annual winter dinner, with 25 extended family members gathered around that long oak table, she lifted her wine glass and set it clearly enough for every fork to pause midair. To Nathan and Isla Real Coles, born into legacy, raised with pride. Then she looked straight at me and to Ava, who's found her place among us, even if not truly of us. Blood, after all, is what binds a family. I sat still, my hands folded tightly under the tablecloth. Nathan didn't say a word. No protest, no correction. Just a slight flush in his cheeks as he reached for the salt. I felt my chest go cold. Not from her words, but from his silence. And that was the moment I knew if I didn't do something now, I'd vanish in this family completely, not in one dramatic fall, but in a quiet erasure that would unfold over years. I looked at Isla, asleep in her carrier next to the fireplace, and made a silent promise. My daughter will never think silence equals safety. That was the last dinner I ever attended as a guest in Gloria Cole's house. That night, after we returned home, I undressed Isla with careful hands while my mind raced silently. Nathan moved around the bedroom as if nothing had happened, as if what his mother said over bone china and candlelight wasn't meant to cut, as if her words hadn't landed directly on my chest and stayed there like a stone. I didn't say much, not because I didn't want to, but because I already knew the rhythm of our arguments, the slow spiral of deflection and explanation. The way he always ended up saying she didn't mean it like that. So I waited until Isla was asleep in her crib. Then I opened my laptop and quietly began something I hadn't dared before. I typed covert maternal control into the search bar and spent 3 hours reading every clinical framework I could find. When your expertise is emotional development, it's hard to admit you've let manipulation creep into your own house. Harder still to name it, but naming is power. And I was done pretending I didn't know what was happening. The next day, I called Claire. She had been my best friend in graduate school before we drifted. Slowly and unintentionally, during the whirlwind of work and motherhood, Claire had always been the sharper one, the one who could see 5 moves ahead in any emotional chess game. She also happened to be a family law attorney, though I wasn't calling her for legal advice. I just needed someone who wouldn't gaslight me with politeness or pretend silence was a form of grace. I told her everything what Gloria had said, how long the dismissiveness had gone on, how Nathan's avoidance had become its own form of loyalty to his mother. When I finished, she didn't rush to fill the silence. She just exhaled slowly and said, "You need documentation, everything from this point forward. You don't confront power like hers with stories. You confront it with record." That night, I bought a new phone and set up a secure folder with a password only I knew. The next time Gloria visited, I activated the voice recorder before she walked through the door. It wasn't even 5 minutes in before she began her usual routines. Isla was in her jumper, smiling up at me, and Gloria crouched beside her with a silk scarf in hand, brushing the baby's cheek. "Your skin is like your father's," she cooed, pure, untouched by confusion. I said nothing. I just stared, willing myself to remember every word exactly as it was spoken. After she left, I labeled the file Session 1. Over the next few weeks, I did what looked like compliance. I smiled when Gloria dropped off her antique photo albums filled with black and white babies posed beside family crests. I accepted the new feeding schedule she'd printed for me, based on what her pediatrician used in 1985. I even agreed to let her take Isla for a walk, so long as I joined. But beneath that exterior, I was studying her, watching how she weaponized concern, how she used inheritance as a lever and loyalty as currency. It wasn't just about me. Gloria had done this before, to Nathan's sister Eleanor, who'd moved to Portland and hadn't come home in 4 years, to Spencer, the cousin who chose to open a jazz cafe instead of joining the family firm. and mysteriously lost all trust funding within 6 months, I realized I was part of a long, quiet pattern of women being tolerated just long enough to be controlled, then erased the moment they refused. One afternoon, Gloria stopped by without calling and found me in sweatpants, Isla napping, the living room a mess of toys and unfolded laundry. She looked around like she'd walked into a crime scene. "Ava," she said slowly, "this isn't how a coal home looks, especially not when raising the next generation." I smiled calmly, almost too calmly, and replied, "You're right. It's not. It's how my home looks." She flinched, just slightly, then recovered. "You're tired. I'll tidy up for you." I stood and blocked her path. "You'll do no such thing." Her lips parted, but no words came out. For the first time, I saw the slightest crack in her polished certainty. That night, I played back the recording. I didn't even need to hear all of it, just the tone, the words, the entitlement that bled through every sentence. And something changed in me. Not rage, not revenge, just clarity. This was no longer about belonging. It was about boundary. Gloria believed power was inherited, but I believed something else power could also be claimed, silently, strategically, permanently. The shift was subtle at first. I didn't storm out or announce ultimatums. That's not how people like Gloria lose power. They don't fear noise. They fear erosion. So I chose silence. Not out of weakness, but out of strategy. I began waking earlier, before Nathan and Isla stirred, using the quiet morning light to create a paper trail. Every comment from Gloria was transcribed, every visit logged, every expense connected to her unsolicited interference in our lives notes, photographs, timestamps. My goal wasn't confrontation, it was clarity, and I was building a map no one could refute when the time came. Nathan noticed the change. He didn't name it, but he felt it. I was calmer, colder maybe, but not cruel. I no longer asked him to stand up for me. I no longer waited for his excuses. I simply stopped inviting him into the emotional weight of what I was carrying, and that terrified him more than any fight we'd had before. One night after Isla had gone to bed, he sat on the edge of the couch and said, "You feel distant, like I'm on the outside of something." I looked at him for a long time before answering. "Maybe now you understand how I've felt since the day I met your mother." He didn't respond right away, just lowered his eyes and nodded, as if some part of him had known all along, but had hoped I wouldn't say it out loud. That was also the week I reconnected with Eleanor, his younger sister. She had left the family orbit years ago, supposedly over a disagreement about schooling for her son. But when I reached out under the soft pretense of catching up, what I received in return was more than a phone call. It was a mirror. Eleanor told me stories that could have been mine guilt-tripped holidays, emotional triangulation, the constant comparison to some invisible standard called a real coal woman. She had tried to push back once, politely, and was met with a cold exclusion from the estate's inner circle, followed by whispered rumors that she was unstable. Her voice didn't carry bitterness, only a quiet warning. The hardest part wasn't what she said. She told me it was how everyone let her say it. That line stayed with me. I began to notice how many people surrounded Gloria, yet said nothing. Board members, family friends, even Nathan's older cousins, who nodded dutifully while she spoke as though they were trained not to flinch. It wasn't just control she had, it was complicity. And I knew then that if I were to protect Isla's emotional inheritance, I had to break more than just silence. I had to break the spell of reverence around her. Claire helped me pull the legal threads. We reviewed the trust documents Gloria had arranged when Isla was born, the ones that named Nathan sole trustee, with advisory rights from family council members. The wording was ambiguous enough to be harmless or dangerous. Depending on who interpreted it, Claire raised an eyebrow. She's setting herself up for long-term control under the mask of generosity. This isn't about gifting wealth. It's about architecting dependence. I felt my chest tighten, not from surprise, but recognition. That was always Gloria's gift. She didn't need to hold you back. She just made it so that moving without her looked like betrayal. Around this time, Gloria began sending books, parenting volumes, etiquette guides, a first edition of some out-of-print legacy memoir titled Raising the Next Cole, all wrapped in ivory ribbon, each with a note signed, from one mother to another. I placed them on a high shelf, not out of reach physically, but symbolically. I wasn't going to burn the evidence. I was going to stack it, visibly, as a monument to the kind of motherhood I was rejecting. Still, Nathan was unraveling. His sleep was restless. He double-checked his calendar obsessively. He hesitated before answering questions, unsure of who he was protecting anymore. I didn't blame him. He had been raised in a system that rewarded obedience and disguised it as grace. He thought being neutral made him fair, but neutrality in the face of manipulation is just quiet permission, and I could no longer afford his silence. The breaking point came, as it always does, when someone pushed just a little too far. Gloria had arranged a family photo day at the estate, supposedly for Isla's milestone memory album. I wasn't consulted. I was informed. The shoot was scheduled during Isla's nap window. When I gently declined, Gloria responded with a 3-paragraph text about family unity and how my discomfort was undermining what generations of Cole women had sacrificed to uphold. I didn't reply. I screenshotted it, saved it, and printed it. Then I looked at Nathan and said simply, "You have a choice, and it's not about your mother. It's about your daughter." He didn't answer, but he didn't go to the photo shoot either. The morning after the photo shoot, the estate's group chat lit up with carefully worded disappointment. Gloria posted a filtered portrait of herself beside Isla, cropped so tightly that my absence wouldn't be noticed unless someone looked too long. The caption read, "Generations strong. Some ties are sewn with thread, others with legacy." Beneath it, a flurry of heart emojis from distant cousins and old family friends. Nathan saw it while sipping his coffee and said nothing, just let the phone slide screen down on the table. I watched him, not for signs of defiance, but for signs of grief. Walking away from Gloria's narrative wasn't just about loyalty. It was about unlearning the version of love he'd been told was unconditional. Claire called me that afternoon. She'd reviewed the terms of the family trust again and found a clause that made her pause. "Did you know Gloria has rights to assign contingent trustees if she deems the current one unfit due to emotional instability or unsound judgment?" My stomach tightened. "And who decides what counts as unstable?" I asked. Claire sighed. "That's the point. She does. Unless challenged." I sat in silence, understanding for the first time that this wasn't just about power, it was about positioning. Gloria wasn't just undermining me socially, she was preparing to replace me legally. That night, while Isla slept between her soft sea animal pillows, I went into the attic and pulled out a storage box marked before. It held old journals, early career notebooks, cards from former clients, the version of me that existed before I became someone's daughter-in-law. In one of those journals was a note I'd scribbled during practicum. Parenting isn't about control. It's about teaching a child to belong to themselves. I underlined it twice. Then I turned to the next page and began writing again, not as therapy, but as testimony. The entries would become records of what I saw, of what I felt, of what I refused to let slip into the quiet shadows Gloria loved to operate in. The turning point came quietly. Gloria hosted a luncheon for a charity gala planning committee, and Nathan was asked to drop by with the baby. Her words exactly. I stayed home, pleading a client meeting. When he returned, he was uncharacteristically quiet, arms stiff as he placed Isla back into her crib. I waited, letting the silence stretch. Finally, he spoke. She introduced Isla as my legacy. Didn't even mention you. I didn't flinch. I'd heard worse. But then he added, she called herself Isla's maternal figure, twice, in front of 5 people. I looked up. And what did you say? He looked down again, his voice lower now. I corrected her. I said Isla has a mother, and she doesn't need to. It wasn't everything, but it was something. The next 2 weeks were full of cold hospitality. Gloria didn't visit. She sent monogrammed onesies in a high chair imported from Italy instead. When I sent one back, she forwarded an email to Nathan titled Unspoken Hurt. The body simply read, I don't know how much more rejection I can take. I've given everything to protect this family's name. I recognized the move instantly. Martyrdom, masquerading as concern. Nathan didn't reply to her. He didn't reply to me either. But that weekend, he brought me a small envelope. Inside was a notarized letter, formally updating Isla's trust documents to include both our names equally as co-trustees. Without contingent override by Gloria, Claire helped me. He said, I should have done this sooner. I didn't cry. I just nodded. There are victories you don't celebrate with champagne. You just breathe deeper and move forward. But I wasn't done. Gloria still held one domain uncontested, her will. Claire confirmed that Gloria had already begun revising it, reinforcing the structure around Nathan and Isla as primary heirs, with advisory roles reserved for legacy protectors. My name didn't appear, not as guardian, not as executor, not even as family. She's laying the groundwork to turn Isla into a figurehead, Claire warned, and you into the footnote. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through my audio files, screenshots, and documentation. Then I opened a new folder and labeled it Transfer Protocol. I didn't know what exactly I would do yet, but I knew this: if Gloria wanted a legacy she could control, she wouldn't find it in this house, and if she wanted her son to stay on the path she built, she would soon discover that path no longer led through him. Gloria called the next morning, not to apologize. That was never her way. She left a voicemail in her carefully measured tone, inviting us to brunch to realign perspectives. It wasn't about food. It was a power play, a coded reminder that she still believed she held the table where decisions were made. I listened to the message twice, not because I didn't understand it the first time, but because I wanted to hear the micro adjustments in her voice, where control slipped, where resentment crept in. She was trying to pull the leash without making the snap too obvious. I didn't answer. Instead, I called Spencer, Nathan's cousin, the one who'd been quietly removed from the family business 5 years ago after rejecting Gloria's offer to manage his expansion. We hadn't spoken in years, but when I explained who I was and what I was facing, there was a pause, and then a quiet laugh, not unkind, more like recognition. "So," he said, "you've seen the curtain now. Not everyone who sees it decides to step behind it. I asked what had happened to him after he left. He told me about the financial sabotage, the social isolation, and then the unexpected freedom. She counts on people being too scared to lose the illusion. But once you walk away, you realize that fear was the leash." I hung up and walked into the nursery. Isla was asleep, mouth slightly open, her hand curled around the edge of her blanket. I sat beside her and let the quiet settle. Then I whispered, "You will never be someone's leverage." That afternoon, I met Claire at a coffee shop downtown. I handed her a thumb drive with labeled files, voice memos, screenshots, financial inconsistencies, and Gloria's text trail of veiled threats and legal maneuvering. Claire scrolled through a few folders, then looked up. "You know, if you use this, it won't be quiet anymore." I nodded. "Then it won't be quiet." I wasn't looking for drama. I was looking for light. Gloria had operated too long in shadow, cloaked in tradition and charm. But charm doesn't erase patterns. It only hides them long enough for damage to look like design. We sent a letter through Claire's firm requesting a formal meeting to discuss boundaries, estate clarity, and parental designation regarding Isla Cole. It was the first time Gloria had seen her name placed second to mine on a document. She didn't respond directly. But within 2 hours, Nathan received a call from his older brother asking if we were really doing this. Doing what, exactly, was never named. That's how power survives in families like these, through euphemism and guilt, never definition. The meeting took place 3 days later in a neutral office suite Claire arranged through a mediator. Nathan sat beside me, stiff at first, then gradually straightening his spine as the minutes passed. Gloria arrived in a cream wool coat, her lipstick exact, her eyes sharp with a betrayal she still didn't understand. She greeted no one, just sat, crossed her legs, and folded her hands like she was waiting for a deposition. I began the conversation, not with accusations, but with facts. The documentation, the financial exclusions, the coercive language, the estate revisions, the implications toward my capacity as a mother. Every sentence was careful, clinical, and undeniable. Gloria tried to interrupt 3 times. Claire raised a hand each time and calmly asked her to wait. When it was finally Gloria's turn to respond, her words came out in a rehearsed cadence. "Everything I've done has been in the interest of protecting this family's legacy. You may not agree with my methods, but I have never acted out of malice." Her voice cracked slightly at the end, not from weakness, but calculation. I responded without raising my voice. "Legacy means nothing if it erases people along the way. I'm not asking you to change. I'm informing you what will happen if you don't." Claire handed over the official notice of estate reevaluation, including our intent to petition for full separation of Isla's trust from Gloria's oversight. A parallel document revoked any advisory role Gloria had claimed or implied. It was all legal, all clean, all pre-reviewed. Gloria blinked once, slowly. Then she smiled. "Not the warm kind, the performative kind. You've learned a lot about how this works, haven't you?" I met her gaze directly. I've always known. I just stopped pretending not to. That evening, Nathan and I walked home without speaking much. Not because we were afraid, but because we were steady. Sometimes power shifts don't happen in courtrooms or screaming matches. Sometimes they happen when the person across from you realizes the rules they wrote no longer apply. That night, I backed up the documents to 3 different drives, printed them, and slid one copy into a fireproof lockbox beside our passports. Then I made tea, sat on the porch, and breathed like I hadn't in years. In the days after the meeting, silence took on a new shape. It wasn't the tense, waiting kind we had grown used to, the kind that hung between words and threatened to rupture. This was a deliberate silence, structured like a wall. Gloria didn't respond to the documents. She didn't call, didn't text, didn't even acknowledge the meeting had happened. But her absence was louder than her presence had ever been. Nathan seemed unsettled by it. He was used to her voice filling every room, her opinion shadowing every choice. Without that sound. He walked slower, looked around more often, like someone navigating without a familiar landmark. One evening, he sat across from me after Isla had gone to sleep and said, "I thought she'd fight back harder." I stirred my tea and replied, "She still might. But now, she has to do it in the open." That's what had changed. The power wasn't gone. It was just exposed. Gloria had spent her life mastering the art of emotional leverage, but the moment we forced everything into daylight, her tactics lost their sharpest edge. Secrecy had always been her weapon of choice. Now she'd have to learn to negotiate. A few days later, a package arrived at our doorstep. No return label, just a cream envelope tucked inside a padded box. Inside it was a handwritten letter from Gloria. 4 pages, neat cursive, careful word choice. She never used the word sorry, but she wrote things like, "Perhaps I've held too tightly to tradition, and it was never my intention to exclude." It read like an attempt at civility, the kind that leaves just enough room for interpretation. I read it once, folded it, and placed it in a drawer. I didn't respond. Instead, I focused on rebuilding what I had almost forgotten how to nurture myself. I returned to part-time work at the clinic. I reconnected with colleagues I hadn't spoken to since maternity leave. I found small joy in structure again, the kind I'd lost in the blur of Gloria's slow intrusion. Being in rooms where no one cared about my last name reminded me who I was before anyone called me Mrs. Cole. It didn't erase the weight of what I'd gone through, but it clarified it. Distance often does that. Not just physical distance, but the emotional kind that lets you see without the fog of obligation. Nathan started therapy on his own, something I hadn't pushed him to do, but deeply hoped he would. He came back from his second session quieter than usual. When I asked how it went, he hesitated, then said, "It's strange realizing how much of yourself was shaped by fear you never named." I didn't say anything. I just reached over and placed my hand on his, not to guide him, but to say I understood. We decided to sell the house shortly after, the one Gloria had helped us buy. On paper, it was a good investment, spacious, classic architecture, beautiful neighborhood, but every corner held echoes of her footsteps, her judgments, her expectations. We found a smaller home near the water. It didn't have chandeliers or formal dining rooms, but it had sunlight in every room and a yard where Isla could grow up barefoot in summer. When we packed the boxes, we didn't speak of what we were leaving behind. We only talked about what we wanted to carry forward. Gloria heard about the move from someone else. She sent a bouquet of lilies and a note that read, "Change is a sign of strength. I hope the new place brings you peace." It was the first time she'd addressed both of us by name, not just Nathan. I didn't respond to that either, sometimes. Silence is not withdrawal. Sometimes it's boundary. Isla turned 3 not long after the move. We threw her a small birthday picnic with a few neighborhood families and friends from my clinic. It wasn't grand, no custom cake, no formal speeches, just laughter, sunshine, and Isla chasing bubbles with her hair flying loose. That evening, Nathan and I sat on the back steps watching her fall asleep in my arms. He looked at me and said, "She's going to grow up free." I nodded, because that was all I ever wanted. Not status, not approval, just the freedom to raise my daughter without a shadow standing between us. Sometimes, healing doesn't look like victory. It looks like peace. It looks like knowing you no longer need to be invited, because you've already chosen where you belong. In the weeks after our move, I began to notice something small but meaningful. I wasn't bracing anymore, not for Gloria's calls, not for Nathan's hesitation, not for the invisible tug of war I'd been stuck in for years. I woke up with a different kind of stillness inside me, not emptiness, but space. Space to hear my own thoughts, to trust my own instincts, to move through the day without anticipating interference. And that space, quietly and steadily, became strength. Isla adjusted faster than I expected. She no longer woke crying from naps or clung to my leg when the doorbell rang. She sang more. She played longer by herself. At first, I thought it was just age. Then I realized she was responding to the absence of tension. She was breathing in the air we had fought to reclaim. Peace isn't something children are taught. It's something they absorb from the room around them, and ours finally had room to hold it. Gloria didn't disappear. She never does. She sent gifts, quiet ones. A wooden puzzle with coal engraved in the corner, a cashmere sweater in Isla's size with a small crest near the hem, nothing loud, just small signatures that said, "I still exist." I didn't return them, but I didn't put them on Isla either. I placed them in a box in the closet, not out of bitterness, but out of choice. I wanted Isla to know where she came from when she was old enough to ask. But I also wanted her to understand she was never required to carry anyone's legacy but her own. Claire and I stayed in touch, more as friends now than allies in crisis. One afternoon, she called with a quiet tone that always meant something had shifted. "You might want to know," she said. "Gloria just updated her will. Nathan is no longer executor." I waited. "And you're listed as Isla's guardian in the event something happens. Full rights, no conditionals." I didn't say anything right away, because sometimes when something ends, it doesn't slam. It just stops echoing. Claire added, "There's no apology, but legally, it's the closest thing to a surrender." I thanked her, hung up, and went to the kitchen where Nathan was slicing fruit for Isla's snack. I told him what Claire said. He exhaled and nodded once. "She knows she lost," he murmured. I corrected him gently. "No, she knows we're no longer playing." That winter, we visited Eleanor in Portland. It was our first real family trip since Isla was born. The air was cleaner, the conversations slower, and for the first time, I saw Nathan laugh without checking who was watching. Eleanor pulled me aside one evening, handed me a warm mug, and said, "You did something I never could." I shook my head. "You walked first. I just refused to come back." She smiled at that, a tired, knowing smile only sisters-in-law can share when they've both lived inside the same war and chosen peace in different directions. By the time we returned home, I had stopped keeping records. There was nothing left to document. No more surprises. No more late-night searches for legal definitions. I let the folders sit untouched in a locked cabinet. Not out of fear, but as proof of where we'd been. The recordings, the letters, the printed screenshots, all of it had served its purpose. Now they were just reminders, not weapons, not shields, just pages in a closed chapter. That spring, I returned to full-time work. Isla started a preschool run by a friend from my early days at the clinic. The transition was smoother than I expected. There were no tears, just curiosity, and I realized she was learning what I had taken years to understand, that letting go doesn't mean losing. It means making space for breath, for joy, for the things no one can hand you and no one can take. Gloria eventually asked for a visit, not through Nathan, not through formality, but through a card addressed in her handwriting. She didn't ask to come over. She asked to meet us at the park, public, neutral, respectful. I discussed it with Nathan. We agreed. 1 hour, no gifts, no conditions. Isla was 4 by then, full of opinions and questions, when she saw Gloria sitting on the bench. She looked at me and whispered, "That's your mama." I smiled and shook my head. "No, honey, that's Daddy's mommy. But she's someone who loves you in her own way." The visit was uneventful, controlled, measured. Gloria didn't criticize. She didn't correct. She simply watched Isla play and said thank you when the hour ended. It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't closure. But it was real, and real, I've learned, is enough. By the time summer arrived, our lives had taken on a rhythm so natural that I sometimes forgot how long it had taken to build it. Not because we were pretending the past didn't exist, but because we had finally stopped letting it write our present. Mornings were quiet, filled with soft rituals, oatmeal with cinnamon, Isla's curious questions, Nathan reading news aloud with his bare feet on the tile. There were no more sudden visits, no unspoken tension under the surface. The house, though smaller than what we once had, felt bigger inside because it was finally ours in every way that mattered. I began keeping different kinds of records, not documentation for legal defense, but small notes for myself, things Isla said, dreams I'd remembered, recipes I wanted to pass down. I realized I was no longer trying to survive someone else's family system. I was writing my own, one rooted in clarity, not performance, in warmth, not control. And strangely, that gave me more room to consider Gloria not as an enemy, but as a person whose limits had shaped mine until I chose otherwise. Nathan changed too, though not all at once. Therapy had made him more honest, but it hadn't made him bolder overnight. Still, I noticed the shift. He no longer minimized things just to maintain comfort. He corrected relatives when they assumed we were still tied to the estate. He declined a role on the board of the family foundation, saying simply, "We're building something different now." He didn't say better. He didn't need to. The difference was clear in the way he slept deeper, laughed longer, and stopped checking his phone every time it buzzed. One evening, we took Isla to a friend's backyard cookout. There was music playing low from a speaker stuck in a planter, and kids running barefoot on wet grass. At one point, someone asked me what it was like being married to a coal. I paused, smiled gently, and said, "It used to define me. Now, it's just a detail." The woman who asked nodded, like she understood more than I'd said. That's the thing about pain that's been processed. It stops demanding center stage. It becomes something you carry quietly, respectfully, without letting it direct the next step. Later that week, we received a formal invitation to Gloria's 75th birthday. It was handwritten, elegant as ever, with calligraphy ink and cream cardstock. No expectations, no passive-aggressive remarks, just a single line at the bottom in her unmistakable pen. "If you choose not to come, I'll understand." I read it twice, not for clarity, but for tone. Then I placed it on the counter for Nathan. "What do you think I asked?" He read it, then looked at me. "What do you want?" I appreciated that question more than I could express. We talked about it that night after Isla went to bed, about boundaries, about presence, about whether some peace was worth preserving even if it was fragile. We didn't go, not out of resentment, but because we were finally clear that showing up isn't always the highest form of respect. Sometimes staying grounded in your truth is, instead. We sent a photo of Isla holding a handmade birthday card, along with a short note Nathan wrote, "We're grateful for the progress, and we're choosing stability." No one could misread that. Gloria never replied, and that was answer enough. That fall, I was invited to speak at a local parenting symposium, not about trauma or estrangement, but about resilience. They asked if I'd share my thoughts on creating emotional safety in families where power had previously defined love. I stood in front of a room of mothers, teachers, and young professionals and spoke not as a survivor, not as someone angry or hurt, but as someone who had rebuilt her life one boundary at a time. "There's no perfect model," I said near the end. "But I've learned this when children see their parents protect peace instead of perform for legacy. They learn to trust themselves." After the event, a woman approached me, probably in her late 20s, wearing a soft blue sweater and holding a notebook covered in underlines. She said, "I think my future mother-in-law is like the woman you described. I keep thinking if I just try harder, I'll belong." I nodded slowly and answered carefully, "Trying harder won't change her, but choosing yourself might change everything." She smiled with something between sadness and hope in her eyes. I had seen that look before in the mirror, years ago. Driving home that evening, the road was lined with yellow trees and soft light through the windshield. Isla had fallen asleep in the back seat, her head tilted against the window. Nathan reached over and turned down the radio. "You handled that talk beautifully," he said. I shrugged gently. I wasn't performing. I was remembering. There's a difference, and that difference, once you've tasted it, is impossible to forget. By the end of that year, I had stopped wondering what would have happened if things had been different. That used to be my quiet obsession. The alternate story I would replay in my mind at night when everything else was still. What if Gloria had accepted me? What if Nathan had spoken up sooner? What if I had pushed back earlier, louder, faster? But those questions no longer served me. They belonged to the version of me who thought peace came from being chosen. Now, I knew better. Real peace comes from choosing yourself and not needing permission to do so. The life we had now wasn't glamorous, but it was stable in the ways that mattered. I knew which groceries were in our fridge without checking. I knew when Isla's preschool needed chaperones and which neighbor could be trusted to watch her in a pinch. I knew that Nathan would never again ask me to tolerate his mother's silence in exchange for family loyalty. And I knew, with a calm certainty, that I didn't owe anyone a performance to be worth keeping. One weekend in late November, we hosted a small gathering with some new friends and their children. The kind of thing that felt easy, like breathing, even with toys scattered across the floor and 3 different casseroles in the oven. One of the guests, a woman named Marin, asked if my family would be joining us for the holidays. I answered honestly, "We're keeping it small. We've found that fewer voices make the room feel fuller." She smiled, and I could see she understood the coded truth. Not everyone needs the full story to recognize it, especially the ones who've lived through their own quiet wars. That night, after Isla went to bed, Nathan found me in the kitchen, barefoot on the tile, holding a cup of leftover cider. He leaned against the door frame and said, "You're different now, not hardened, just solid." I thought about that word, solid. It didn't always sound flattering, but in that moment, I understood what he meant. I wasn't bracing. I wasn't adjusting. I wasn't constantly editing myself to fit into someone else's expectation. I had become the version of me that Gloria would never approve of, but more importantly, the version I no longer needed her to. A few weeks later, we received a Christmas card from the Cole estate. It was glossy, gold-edged, with a formal family photo taken in the grand drawing room. Gloria stood at the center, surrounded by relatives dressed in coordinated deep green. Isla and I weren't mentioned. Nathan's name appeared once, in a brief caption under his older brother's title, "The Next Generation of Cole Leadership." Nathan looked at it once, then slid it into the drawer beside unpaid coupons and expired warranty mailers. Neither of us said a word. We didn't need to. Some messages are clearest when left unanswered. On Christmas morning, we stayed home, no rushed packing, no tight smiles over roast beef or awkward questions about boundaries. Just the three of us, pancakes on the griddle, Isla in mismatched pajamas and bed hair. Nathan gave me a small box with a thin silver bracelet inside. The inscription read, "Not real family, real love." It took me a second to register the callback. Then I laughed quietly. "That's dark," I said, tracing the lettering with my finger. He nodded. "I thought you'd appreciate the precision." I did. As the new year began, I started writing again, not in defense, not to document pain, but to capture memory, to preserve what this chapter of my life had taught me. I wrote about silence as a survival tool, about the danger of inherited roles, about how control often dresses itself as tradition. I wrote about motherhood without approval, marriage without inheritance, an identity without legacy. And I wrote for Isla, even if she wouldn't read it for another 10 or 15 years. I wanted her to know that I didn't quietly accept things for her sake. I fought for air so she could breathe differently. Gloria never apologized. She never wrote a letter or offered an olive branch in words. But she honored the boundaries we built. She no longer sent monogrammed gifts or voiced her disapproval through other relatives. Occasionally, we crossed paths at community events or charity circles. She would nod politely. I would nod back. And we kept walking in opposite directions. Some people think resolution means reunion, that every wound must be wrapped in forgiveness or else it will fester. But I've learned the opposite can be true. Sometimes the most powerful closure is the kind that doesn't try to rewrite the story, just ends it where it deserves to end, with clarity, with self-respect, with enough distance to breathe. A few months ago, I sat at the kitchen table with Isla on a rainy afternoon, cutting shapes from colored paper for her school project. The scissors weren't sharp, and the glue smelled faintly sour, but she was fully absorbed, her little hands moving with concentration. At one point, she paused, looked up at me, and asked, "Mom, are we a big family or a small one?" I smiled at her question, not because it was silly, but because it wasn't. I answered slowly, "We're the kind of family that fits together just right." She seemed satisfied with that and went back to gluing stars to her sky. But the truth is, that one moment carried more weight than she could understand. It reminded me that everything I had fought through wasn't just for my peace, it was for her clarity. In many ways, the fight was over, not because I won, but because I stopped playing the game. Gloria still existed, still sent the occasional card, still hosted formal brunches that we were no longer invited to, and none of that hurt anymore. I had made peace with not being chosen. I had learned that real belonging isn't a room you're invited into. It's one you build yourself, from walls you don't owe to anyone, and a roof that doesn't collapse when someone withdraws approval. Nathan's relationship with his mother had settled into distant civility. He still received updates through the family office, still sent polite messages on holidays, but the emotional gravity she used to hold over him had disappeared. Therapy gave him language for things he once called complicated. Now, he named them for what they were: emotional debt, conditional affection, and silence disguised as survival. I watched him become not just a better husband, but a man free of inherited patterns. And in watching him, I understood something even deeper. Sometimes, growth doesn't look like confrontation. It looks like quiet refusal to repeat what hurt you. I kept writing, not to publish or prove anything, but to keep my voice sharp. So many women lose their voice in the slow drip of being agreeable. I had almost forgotten mine once. Now, I used it to help others find theirs. I volunteered for a nonprofit that supported young mothers estranged from toxic family systems. I listened to stories that echoed mine, but never told mine in full, not because I was hiding it, but because I had already lived it. I was no longer seeking release. I was offering space. Every now and then, someone still asked me how we managed to set boundaries with someone as powerful as Gloria Cole. I always answer carefully, because power doesn't only come from money or inheritance. It comes from history, from the stories people have agreed to uphold. Gloria was powerful because the people around her had built her throne from their silence. Once we stopped handing her the bricks, the structure began to sink, not all at once, but surely, patiently, and then completely. What surprised me most wasn't the loss. It was the gain, the freedom to live a life without being defined by resistance. When your whole world has been shaped by what you're protecting yourself from, it's hard to imagine what it feels like to live without armor. But that's exactly what we had built. Not a fortress, not a shield, a home. One where no one had to earn their place by being smaller than someone else's shadow. Isla is 5 now. She likes to tell people she has a garden, even though it's really just a patch of soil with 2 stubborn tomato plants and some wild mint. She checks it every morning with serious eyes and a plastic watering can. One day she asked if we could add roses. I told her roses take time. She said, "I don't mind waiting," and I believed her, because she's growing up with a mother who no longer apologizes for existing, and a father who knows that silence is not love. She's growing up in a home that once came from fracture, but was built on intention. Sometimes I think back to the first time Gloria looked at me across that long dining table, raised her glass, and said, "I'd never be real family." I remember how still I sat, how quiet I stayed, how Nathan said nothing, and how it all felt like the beginning of something breaking. But now I know it wasn't the beginning of collapse. It was the first step towards something else, something stronger, something mine. So if you're listening to this and you've been told that you don't belong, that you're not enough, that family is something you have to earn, please hear this. You are allowed to define your family by the way people make you feel, not just by the blood that ties them to you. You're allowed to build something entirely new from the pieces they tried to discard, and you are allowed to walk away without guilt, even if no one ever says you were right, because you don't need a name in someone else's will to matter. Sometimes the most powerful inheritance you can give your child is the lesson that respect isn't earned by surrender. It's built by remembering who you are when no one claps for you, and that, more than any legacy, is what real family looks like.